1400 hours. September 12, 1943. 7,000 feet above the Gran Sasso d'Italia. Inside the cramped fuselage of a DFS-230, Major Otto Harold Morse monitors a single, vibrating needle. The altimeter is the only thing moving with purpose. There is no engine vibration, no smell of high-octane fuel, and no hydraulic hum. There is only the acoustic paradox, the deafening roar of wind rushing over doped canvas, paired with the absolute mechanical silence of a powerless aircraft. At this altitude, the airframe is a steel tube skeleton wrapped in fabric, a construction mocked by traditional aviators as a mere toy. Below, the jagged limestone peaks of the Abruzzo crags rise to meet them. The logistics of the mission are mathematically grim. The projected airframe loss rate for this insertion is exactly 100%. To land on the boulder-strewn plateau of the Campo Imperatore, the glider must be intentionally crashed. There is no runway, no margin for error, and no second approach. Morse feels the airframe shudder as it encounters mountain thermals. Every rivet and wire is under calculated stress, pushing structural integrity of wood and linen to terminal velocity. The men sit in a narrow line, their weight calculated to the kilogram to maintain the center of gravity. They are descending into a fortress. But to understand how 50 men ended up on a mountain peak deemed inaccessible by the laws of aviation, we have to look at the mathematics of desperation that birthed the toy in the first place. The Campo Imperatore was not merely a hotel, it was a vertical prison. At 6,300 feet, the site offered a 360-degree observation radius over the Italian valley. In tactical terms, the terrain acted as a massive force multiplier for the defenders. To assault such a position using conventional infantry would require a division. This necessitated desperation mathematics, a clinical calculation where the probability of failure is outweighed only by the cost of inaction. The mission was binary, success or catastrophe. High Command looked at the statistics from the 1941 invasion of Crete. During Operation Mercury, the Fallschirmjäger suffered a 25% fatality rate within 24 hours. Parachutes were unsteerable, and men were scattered over miles. Against a concentrated defense on a mountain peak, a traditional drop was statistically certain to fail. A slow-moving Junkers 52 transport, struggling with thin mountain air and high stall speeds, would be a target for anti-aircraft batteries long before any chutes deployed. Powered flight introduced lethal variables. Engine noise travels for miles in thin atmosphere, providing minutes of early warning. Furthermore, the wing loading of a standard transport plane prevents it from navigating tight thermal corridors. To fly slow enough for an accurate drop is to flirt with a low-altitude stall. To fly fast enough for safety is to overshoot the target entirely. A solution was needed that removed the engine from the tactical equation entirely and forever. This led to the inverted fortress concept. Traditional fortifications are designed to repel horizontal advances, utilizing height to maximize defensive range. However, the more vertical a defense becomes, the more blind spots it creates directly overhead. An inverted fortress is uniquely vulnerable to a vertical, silent descent. This tactic required a vehicle capable of ignoring gravity without the mechanical signature of a combustion engine. It required a kinetic delivery system that could plummet at a steep angle, manage extreme drag, and come to a complete halt on a jagged, microscopic landing zone. High Command demanded a solution that didn't exist. They were told it would require a miracle. Instead, they were given the specialized work of a carpenter. The DFS-230 was a machine defined by exclusion. Designed by Hans Jacobs, its engineering reflected a brutal simplicity required for tactical glider warfare. The primary structure was a fuselage of welded chrome-molybdenum steel tubing, a rigid skeleton that provided crash protection for 9 Commandos within. Over this was stretched a skin of impregnated fabric linen. This was not a matter of budget, but of mass. In the realm of unpowered flight, every gram is a penalty against the glide ratio. The aircraft lacked traditional landing gear. It utilized a jettisonable wheel carriage for takeoff. Once airborne, wheels were discarded, leaving only a central spring-loaded ashwood skid for landing. This skid was first component in a series of mechanical solutions designed to solve the postage stamp landing problem. The entire DFS-230 structure was the scalpel for a precise operation. The glider possessed a 12-to-1 glide ratio. Under standard atmospheric conditions, this allowed the DFS-230 to traverse 12 kilometers of horizontal distance for every single kilometer of vertical drop. However, on Gran Sasso, a high glide ratio was a liability. The pilot needed to dump altitude rapidly without exceeding structural VNE, the velocity never exceed, which would tear fabric from the wings. To achieve this, the DFS-230 was equipped with a stupid trick: large, perforated dive spoilers. These spoilers disturbed laminar flow over wing, increasing drag and allowing a steep, Stuka-like descent angle without corresponding increase in airspeed. This was a critical application of Reynolds numbers. The pilot had to maintain enough airflow over control surfaces to prevent a stall while simultaneously bleeding off kinetic energy that would otherwise carry the glider past small mountain plateau. The wing loading was calibrated for this high-altitude environment. Too low, and the glider would be tossed by unpredictable mountain gusts. Too high, and landing speed would be lethal. Final deceleration relied on a more primitive yet effective modification. 3 braking rockets were mounted in the nose. These solid fuel canisters were wired to fire upon touchdown, providing violent counter-thrust. This reduced ground roll from hundreds of meters to a fraction of that distance. The aerodynamic physics of the landing were governed by dead-stick logic. In a powered aircraft, the engine provides a safety net, the ability to abort and climb. In a glider, that safety net is stripped away. This absence of power forces a high level of mechanical precision. Without a throttle, the pilot manages a finite reservoir of potential energy. Every degree of flap, every bank of the ailerons, is a non-reversible transaction of altitude for stability. The pilot becomes an extension of the airframe, calculating exact moment to trade remaining airspeed for a stationary position on the jagged granite rock. The result is a focus level unattainable to those with the luxury of a second chance. Because the DFS-230 could not fly again, it had to land perfectly. On paper, it was a kite. In the air, it was a 2,000-pound kinetic dart. And on September 12, the dart was thrown. At precisely 14:03, the mechanical link between the Junker's 52-tow planes and the gliders was severed. The release lever in the cockpit moved with a sharp, industrial click, and the thick steel tow cable surged forward, falling away into the abyss. In that microsecond, the DFS-230 transitioned from a towed vehicle into a dedicated aerodynamic projectile. It was now operating purely on the laws of potential energy. The pilot, Lieutenant Meyer, was no longer managing a flight path, he was managing his finite reservoir of altitude. Every centimeter of descent had to be traded for a specific tactical outcome. Navigating the jagged Abruzzo Massif meant entering the thermal gauntlet. Without a throttle to compensate for air density changes, the pilot was forced to fight the mountain's erratic vertical currents. Updrafts from the sun-heated limestone crags threatened to push the craft upward into the visual range of Italian binoculars, while sudden downdrafts on the leeward side risked slamming the fragile underbelly into the scree. The only sound was the Aeolian harp effect, the high-pitched, harmonic vibration of wind rushing through the external bracing wires. It was a haunting, resonant drone that amplified as the airspeed increased, yet it remained physically contained within the slipstream of the airframe. This acoustic profile created the detection gap. On the terraces of the Campo Imperatore, the 200 Carabinieri guards were not scanning the sky for canvas shapes. Their sensory training and biological instincts were tuned to the heavy, low-frequency throb of BMW radial engines. They expected the mechanical violence of a paratrooper drop, the vibration of heavy transports, and the visual clutter of hundreds of parachutes. The gliders, by contrast, occupied a frequency range that the human ear often filters out as ambient background noise. By the time the gliders were within audible range, they were already traveling too fast for a defensive response. They were technically invisible because they were acoustically irrelevant to the defender's expectation of warfare. The pilots pushed the control sticks forward, tilting the gliders into a calculated 45-degree dive. This was the moment of total mechanical stress. The internal chrome-molybdenum skeleton groaned as it absorbed the increasing G-forces. The doped linen skin, usually taut, began to ripple and snap with the ferocity of a sail in a gale as air pressure climbed. The pilots monitored the airspeed indicators with clinical focus. Exceeding the velocity never exceed limit would cause the fabric to shear from the wings, leading to absolute structural disintegration. They were pushing the aircraft to the absolute edge of its engineering envelope to minimize their profile against the horizon. The hotel grew larger in the distorted cockpit glass, a stone monolith surrounded by lethal jagged rock. The transition from silent descent to calculated kinetic impact was now inevitable. Every mechanical component was strained. Every commando braced for the collision. The altitude was gone. The speed was 100 knots. There was no go-around lever. There was only the cold, unyielding physics of immediate kinetic impact. Success awaited. The ground approached with the terminal finality of a ballistic trajectory. Lieutenant Meyer looked through the plexiglass, seeing not a meadow, but a chaotic field of jagged limestone and gray scree. This was the unlandable slope, a terrain that defied every existing standard of aviation safety. To land here was not to perform an arrival, but to commit to a high-speed controlled collision. As the altimeter needle spun toward the zero mark, Meyer waited for the precise mechanical window required to preserve the lives of the 9 men behind him. At exactly 10 feet above the granite surface, he engaged the firing circuit. 3 nose-mounted rockets ignited with a violent chemical roar and a sudden cloud of gray smoke. The forward thrust of the glider was instantly met by the massive opposing force of solid fuel exhaust, creating a momentary envelope of deceleration that defied the aircraft's natural momentum. This was the critical moment of energy management. The DFS-230 transitioned from flight to friction as the central Ashwood skid made first contact with the mountain. The sound was an industrial scream. Steel-reinforced timber scraped across ancient rock, throwing sparks and pulverized stone into the thin mountain air. In this compressed 3-second interval, the airframe performed a masterclass in kinetic dissipation. Traveling at over 100 feet per second, the glider possessed approximately 2 million joules of kinetic energy, the equivalent of a heavy truck hitting a wall at highway speeds. Every weld in the chrome-molybdenum frame was tested as this energy was converted into heat and sound through the violent interaction of the skid and the slope. The fuselage shuddered with a frequency that threatened to shear the bolts from the seat mounts, the canvas skin drumming under the extreme stress of the deceleration. Meyer used the rudder to steer the grinding skid between the largest boulders, a high-stakes slalom where a single error would result in the structural shearing of the wings or a lethal rollover. Then, the motion stopped. The glider sat motionless, resting on its belly in a plume of dust just 15 meters from the hotel's rear entrance. The immediate tactical success of the mission relied entirely on the reaction time deficit. Military engagement is a competition between mechanical speed and human cognition. The Italian Carabinieri Guards were physiologically incapable of processing the event in real time. Their brains were calibrated for the auditory warning of a radial engine and the slow visual progression of an approaching infantry line. Instead, they were faced with a silent, fabric-covered phantom that had appeared from the clouds, decelerated, and delivered 10 armed commandos to their doorstep in the time it takes to draw a single breath. The technical speed of the DFS-230's arrival stripped the defenders of the ability to even chamber a round. They were trapped in a state of biological paralysis. By the time a guard could mentally transition from peace to combat, the commandos were already exiting the side hatch, their boots hitting the ground before the dust from the landing had even settled. They had bypassed the fortress's external defenses not by destroying them, but by arriving faster than the human nervous system could register a threat. It was a victory of engineering over biology. The toy had accomplished what an entire motorized division simply could not. The infiltration of the primary target was now technically complete, and the initial tactical insertion was a total success. But the logistics of extraction meant that the mathematics of the mission were now about to break under the weight of an unplanned variable that would soon jeopardize every single life. The capture of Mussolini was achieved in under 4 minutes without a single shot fired. However, this tactical success immediately collided with a logistical dead end. The DFS-230s were kinetic darts. They possessed no means of return. The Campo Imperatore was now a mountain island surrounded by potentially hostile territory. To extract the high-value target, the operation relied on the Fieseler Phi 156 Storch, a specialized SDOL aircraft engineered for the impossible. The Storch was a masterpiece of low-speed aerodynamics. It featured full-length fixed leading-edge slats and massive slotted flaps that allowed it to maintain lift at airspeeds as low as 50 km per hour. But at 6,300 feet, the air density was significantly reduced. In the thin atmosphere of the Abruzzo peaks, the Argus S-10 engine could not produce its rated 240 horsepower, and the wings could not generate standard sea-level lift. This created a crisis of weight-to-power ratio. Captain Heinrich Gerlach, the pilot, calculated that the aircraft could safely carry only himself and Mussolini. The physics were clear. The density-altitude rendered the plane's performance marginal at best. Then came the stall-speed gamble. Otto Skorzeny, the 6'4" commando leader, demanded to be on the flight. Gerlach initially refused, citing the cold mathematics of the airframe's limit. Every kilogram added was a direct subtraction from the climb rate. In the thin mountain air, the margin between flight and a ballistic stall was razor-thin. Eventually, under extreme pressure, Gerlach relented. The Storch was now overloaded by nearly 250 pounds beyond its calculated high-altitude safety limit. This was the 1-pound margin, the terrifying reality that in these conditions, the weight of a single extra piece of equipment, or an unfastened buckle, could prevent the wings from achieving the critical angle of attack needed to clear the precipice. The takeoff was not a standard roll, but a desperate sprint toward an abyss. 12 commandos held the tail and wings of the Storch, acting as a human brake while Gerlach throttled the Argus engine to its absolute thermal limit, monitoring the manifold pressure with surgical intensity. Gerlach relied on the long-stroke Oleos struts to absorb the initial shocks of the terrain during the brief, violent takeoff acceleration. On his signal, they released. The Storch surged forward across a 30-meter patch of cleared rocks. It did not achieve flight before the land ended. Instead, it plummeted over the vertical edge of the cliff, disappearing from the sight of the men above. For several agonizing seconds, the aircraft simply fell through the thin air, trading altitude for the airspeed the engine could not provide on the ground. Only at the last moment did the wings catch enough laminar flow to level out, skim the valley floor, and begin a sluggish, heavy climb. They had successfully transitioned from high-risk aerodynamic concepts to a proven, clinical reality. The math had barely held. The gliders were left behind, rotting on the rocks, their job done. But their technical DNA was about to change warfare forever. The 12 DFS-230 airframes remained on the Campo Imperatore plateau, their fabric skins eventually shredded by alpine winds and their steel skeletons corroded by seasonal snow. To the casual observer, they were debris, the discarded remnants of a desperate gamble. However, the engineering data harvested from the Gran Sasso raid served as the technical foundation for the massive airborne armadas of the later war years. The success of silent kinetic insertion validated the development of the British airspeed Horsa and the American Waco CG-4A. These larger descendants utilized the same wooden construction and high-drag flap systems to deliver entire platoons and heavy ordnance directly into the rear echelons of the Atlantic Wall. The DFS-230 had proven that a powerless airframe was not a toy, but a surgical instrument of high-precision warfare. Today, the ghost in the machine survives in the hangars of elite special operations units. The modern stealth helicopter, with its specialized rotor geometry and acoustic-absorbing coatings, is the spiritual successor to the wood and linen glider. Both technologies share a singular objective: the exploitation of the detection gap. By minimizing the mechanical signature of the insertion vehicle, engineers allow operators to arrive before the defender's cognitive cycle can initiate a response. This remains the pinnacle of tactical logic. We owe this realization to the cloth and tube engineers who understood that in the face of superior firepower, the most lethal weapon is the one that makes the least noise. They prioritized aerodynamic efficiency over raw horsepower and tactical surprise over sheer mass. Their legacy is the proof that mechanical ingenuity can solve equations that firepower alone cannot ever touch. It stands as a solemn, technical reminder that sophistication does not always require an engine. They mocked the glider because it lacked power. They forgot that gravity never runs out of fuel.